You ever hear a rifle complain before it fails? The sound was barely there, a soft metallic hesitation buried under the usual morning noise of boots on concrete and lockers slamming shut. But it was enough to make Logan Hayes stop mid-motion, his jaw tightening as he cycled the bolt again and frowned at the subtle resistance that didn't belong, the kind of thing no diagnostic app would ever catch, but every operator felt in their bones. And that irritation spread fast across the bay as a couple of younger SEALs glanced over, sensing something off, while a few feet away an old man kept moving a mop across the floor in slow, steady strokes like none of it mattered, his worn boots whispering against the polished concrete, his back slightly bent, his gray hair catching the harsh fluorescent light, invisible in the way only someone like him could be in a room full of elite warfighters, until he spoke. His voice low and gravelly but precise. Your safety pin's off by about 1/3 of a millimeter. And the room paused just long enough for the words to register before the laughter came, quick and sharp, cutting through the tension as one of the operators shook his head and muttered something about janitors playing gunsmith, while Logan turned slowly, eyes narrowing as he looked the old man up and down, taking in the faded work shirt, the cleaning cart, the complete lack of anything that suggested authority. And yet there was something in the way the man stood, or maybe in the way he didn't react to the laughter, that made the air feel just slightly heavier, just enough to irritate Logan further as he stepped closer, holding the rifle out like a challenge. You hear that, old-timer? You think you know something we don't? The old man didn't answer right away, just set the mop aside with careful hands and turned, his pale blue eyes settling on the weapon not with curiosity, but with recognition, like it wasn't just a tool, but something familiar, something remembered, and that silence stretched long enough to make one of the younger SEALs shift uncomfortably, though Logan only smirked and pushed the rifle forward. Go ahead then. Fix it. If you can even tell what you're looking at. And the chuckles returned, lighter now, but edged with expectation. The kind of anticipation that comes before a joke lands. Yet the old man simply took the rifle, his grip steady despite the years etched into his hands. And for a brief second, as his fingers brushed along the metal, everything else seemed to fade. The noise, the movement, the weight of the room, leaving only that quiet, deliberate contact, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear, and somewhere in the back, Ethan Cole stopped smiling, his gaze narrowing just slightly as he watched the way the old man held the weapon, not awkward, not hesitant, but exact, like every movement had already been decided long before this moment. And Logan felt it too, though he couldn't explain why. That faint shift in the atmosphere, the subtle sense that the test he'd just thrown out so casually might not go the way he expected. But pride kept him rooted where he stood, arms crossing as he waited for the inevitable stumble, unaware that for the first time that morning, he wasn't the one in control of what came next. Daniel Brooks did not rush. And that alone began to change the rhythm of the room as the seconds stretched longer than anyone expected, his hands moving with a kind of quiet certainty that did not match the image they had already decided he was, his thumb brushing lightly along the side of the receiver before pausing at a point no one else had even considered important. And Logan felt a flicker of irritation sharpen into something else, something harder to name, as he watched the old man tilt the rifle slightly, angling it toward the overhead lights as if he were reading something written into the metal itself. Not guessing, not experimenting, just confirming. While the faint hum of the fluorescent bulbs overhead seemed suddenly louder in the silence that had replaced the earlier laughter, and somewhere behind Logan, one of the younger operators shifted his weight, boots scraping softly against the concrete, unsure now if he was supposed to keep watching or look away, because the energy had changed, subtle but undeniable. And Brooks finally spoke again, not looking at any of them, his eyes still fixed on the rifle. It is not broken, he said, his voice even, almost absent of emotion. It is just not aligned with itself. And that drew a short, skeptical breath from Logan, who uncrossed his arms and stepped closer, his pride refusing to give ground. That does not mean anything, he replied, though his tone had lost a fraction of its earlier confidence, and Brooks did not argue. Did not explain. He simply adjusted his grip, his fingers settling into place with a familiarity that made Ethan's stomach tighten slightly as he watched, because that was not how someone handled a weapon they barely understood, That was how someone handled something they had carried long enough to trust without thinking, and the old man's movements remained small, almost understated, a slight turn here, a measured pressure there. Nothing dramatic, nothing showy. But each action connected to the next with a precision that did not leave room for hesitation, and Logan noticed it. Too now, the absence of trial and error, the lack of wasted motion, the way the rifle seemed to respond rather than resist, and for the first time that morning, he did not interrupt, did not joke, he simply watched, his eyes narrowing as the old man pressed lightly against a component Logan had checked himself less than 10 minutes earlier, and there was a soft, almost imperceptible shift, a faint internal realignment that produced a cleaner, sharper sound than before, and Brooks paused again. Listening, actually listening, as if the rifle had just answered him. And that was the moment Ethan exhaled slowly, barely aware he had been holding his breath, because he understood something Logan did not yet want to admit, that this was no guess, no lucky adjustment. This was intention, practiced, and refined over time no one in that room could measure, and Brooks cycled the action once, smoothly this time, the resistance gone, replaced by a crisp, effortless motion that felt different even to Logan's trained hands when the old man handed it back, and for a second Logan did not take it, his gaze locked on Brooks, searching for some sign, some explanation that would put the world back into its proper order. But there was none, only that same calm, unreadable expression, and the old man simply nodded once toward the rifle as if to say it was finished, nothing more to add. And in the quiet that followed, the weight of what had just happened settled over the room, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough that no one felt like laughing anymore. And somewhere in that silence, Logan finally reached out and took the rifle, slower this time, his grip tightening slightly as he realized that whatever he had expected from this moment, it had already slipped beyond his control. Logan Hayes felt at the moment the rifle settled into his hands again, a difference so subtle it should have been easy to dismiss. But it was not. The action smoother, the balance somehow more honest, like the weapon had stopped resisting him and started cooperating, and that alone was enough to put a quiet pressure behind his eyes as he cycled it once more, slower this time, listening the way he had just watched the old man listen. And the sound came back clean, precise, exactly what it should have been from the beginning. And for a brief second, he said nothing, which in itself drew attention because Logan was not a man known for silence. While across from him Daniel Brooks had already turned away, retrieving the mop as if the moment had ended the second he let go of the rifle, his movements returning to that same steady rhythm, water dragging across concrete in soft arcs, leaving behind a thin reflective sheen that caught the overhead lights, and that normalcy felt almost out of place now, as if the room had not quite caught up with what had just happened, and Ethan Cole shifted his stance, eyes moving between Logan and the old man, his instincts telling him there was more here than a simple adjustment, something deeper that did not belong in a maintenance issue. And he finally spoke, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the quiet. "Sir, how did you know where to look?" The question hung there, respectful without quite intending to be, and for a moment Brooks did not answer, his mop gliding forward another few inches before he stopped, straightened slightly, and glanced back over his shoulder, not at Ethan specifically, but at the space between them, as if the question itself mattered more than who asked it. "It sounded wrong," he said simply, then resumed his work, and that answer should have been unsatisfying, too vague to carry weight. But it did not feel that way, not after what they had just seen, because Logan knew the sound had been there, and he had ignored it, dismissed it as minor. And now that realization settled into him with a quiet discomfort he did not like, while one of the younger SEALs let out a short breath, half laugh, half uncertainty. "That is it? You just listened?" And no one joined in this time, the humor not landing the way it had before, because the room had shifted, the old assumptions no longer holding their shape, and Logan finally stepped forward again, slower now, his posture less confrontational, but no less intense. "You ever work on these before?" he asked, watching closely for any hesitation, any sign that would bring this back into something familiar. But Brooks only shook his head once, a small motion. "Not this model," he replied, and that answer should have ended it, should have restored the balance of expertise, but it did the opposite, because if it was not familiarity then it was something else entirely, something harder to define and even harder to challenge, and Ethan felt it click into place in his mind, that this was not about parts or tools or manuals. It was about understanding at a level most people never reached, the kind that came from time and experience layered so deeply it stopped needing explanation. And he glanced at Logan, seeing the same realization beginning to take hold there, even if pride still held it back from being spoken. And in the background, the steady sound of the mop continued, grounding the moment in something simple, something ordinary, while the extraordinary settled quietly around it. And for the first time since the morning began, no one reached for a joke, no one tried to fill the silence, because they all felt it now, that they were standing in the presence of something they had not recognized, something that did not announce itself, did not demand attention, but revealed its weight the moment it was tested. And Logan lowered his gaze briefly to the rifle in his hands before looking back at the old man, not with dismissal this time, but with a growing awareness that whatever he thought this was when it started, it had already become something else entirely. Just a simple statement that carried more weight than it should have, because it left too much unsaid, and that absence of detail began to fill the room in its own way, as each of them tried to place it, tried to connect it to something they understood, but nothing quite fit, and Logan shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his grip on the rifle as if grounding himself. "What kind of training?" he pressed, unable to let it rest there. And for the first time, Brooks looked directly at him, his pale eyes steady, not challenging, not defensive, just present. "The kind where mistakes are not useful," he replied, and that answer landed differently than the others, not vague this time, but precise in a way that did not invite further questions. And Logan felt it settle into him, quiet but firm, because he understood exactly what that meant, even if he did not want to acknowledge it out loud. And the room fell still again, not from tension this time, but from recognition, as the pieces began to align in ways none of them had expected when the morning started. And somewhere near the back, one of the younger operators straightened unconsciously, his posture shifting without realizing why, as if responding to something unspoken. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his earlier uncertainty replaced with a quiet certainty of his own, that this was not coincidence, not luck, but something earned long before any of them had stepped into this room. And Brooks turned away once more, returning to the simple task in front of him, the mop gliding across the floor, steady, controlled, unaffected, while behind him the men who had once filled the space with noise and confidence now stood in a different kind of silence. One that carried weight, one that asked for nothing but gave everything away. And Logan finally lowered the rifle slightly, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement, though he did not yet have the words for it, only the growing awareness that whatever line had existed between them before, it was no longer where he thought it was. No one moved to break the silence, not because they were unsure of what to say, but because saying anything at all felt like it would disturb something that had already settled into place, something heavier than words. And Logan Hayes stood there longer than he intended, the rifle now resting against his palm with a familiarity that felt slightly different than before, as if the moment had left a trace on it, or maybe on him. And he glanced down at it again, replaying the earlier hesitation in his mind, the faint resistance he had dismissed without thought. And for the first time that morning, he questioned not the weapon, but his own certainty. And that realization stayed with him as he looked back toward Daniel Brooks, who continued working with the same unhurried rhythm, unaffected by the shift he had caused, the mop tracing another clean line across the floor, as if that was the only task that mattered. And that quiet persistence began to draw more attention than anything he had said, because it made the moment feel complete in a way none of them expected, as if there was nothing left to prove. And Ethan Cole felt it too. That subtle closing of a door they had not realized was open, and he took a small step forward, lowering his voice again, not out of hesitation this time, but out of respect that had formed without permission. "Sir, you said mistakes are not useful," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Then what is?" And the question hung there, not challenging, not demanding, just searching. And Brooks slowed his movement slightly, the mop pausing at the edge of a faint scuff mark before he pushed it forward once more, clearing it with a single pass. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm weight it always had. "Paying attention," he said, simple, direct, and final. And that answer settled into the room differently than anything before it, because it did not require interpretation, it did not leave space for doubt, it just existed, and Logan felt it land in a place he could not ignore, because he knew it was true, not as a concept, but as something he had just experienced without recognizing it at the time, and that realization carried a quiet edge to it, not sharp enough to cut, but enough to remind him that there were still things he had not mastered, and behind him one of the younger seals shifted again, this time standing a little straighter, his earlier confidence replaced with something more measured, more aware, and Ethan nodded almost unconsciously, as if the answer confirmed something he had already begun to understand, and for a moment no one spoke, no one moved. The room held in that same steady stillness, until Logan finally exhaled, a slow release of tension he had not noticed building, and he adjusted his grip on the rifle once more before stepping back, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement, giving the old man space without being asked. And that single step carried more meaning than anything he had said that morning, because it marked a shift in position, not just physical, but internal, and Brooks did not look up, did not react. He simply continued working, the quiet sound of the mop returning to fill the space, steady and consistent, as if nothing had changed at all. And yet everything had, because now the men in that room were no longer looking past him, they were looking at him, not with curiosity or amusement, but with a growing understanding that what stood in front of them was not defined by the role they had assigned, but by something far deeper, something that did not need recognition to exist. And as the light reflected off the clean floor beneath their boots, the silence that remained was no longer empty. It was full, carrying with it the weight of a lesson that had been given without force, without demand, and without a single wasted word. The rhythm of the room slowly returned, but it did not sound the same anymore. Each movement more deliberate, each action carrying a quiet awareness that had not been there before, and Logan Hayes felt it settle into his posture as he turned the rifle once more in his hands, not inspecting it this time, not searching for a flaw, but understanding it in a way that felt closer to what he had just witnessed. And he cycled the action again, listening, really listening now, the clean, precise sound, echoing softly in the space between them. And it was right, exactly right, and that alone held more weight than any confirmation he could have asked for. While across the bay, Daniel Brooks continued moving with the same steady cadence, pushing the mop forward, pulling it back, leaving behind a surface so clean it reflected the overhead lights in long, uninterrupted lines, and that reflection caught Logan's attention for a brief second, because he saw it then, not clearly, not fully, but enough, the way Brooks positioned himself without thinking, always angled just enough to see everything around him without turning his head, the way his movements wasted nothing, not a step, not a motion. And that realization landed quietly but firmly, because it was not something learned from manuals or drills. It was something built over time, refined until it became invisible even to the one who carried it. And Ethan Cole noticed it too, his eyes narrowing slightly as he followed the same details, connecting them piece by piece, until the picture forming in his mind no longer fit the role they had assigned. And he took a small step closer to Logan, lowering his voice. "You see it now, do not you?" he said, not asking, but confirming, and Logan did not answer right away, his gaze still fixed on the old man. But the slight shift in his stance was enough, the tension gone, replaced by something steadier, something more grounded, and one of the younger SEALs, still trying to reconcile what he had seen with what he believed, let out a quiet breath and shook his head. "He is just a janitor," he muttered, though the conviction was not there anymore, not the way it had been earlier, and no one responded, not because they agreed, but because the statement no longer held weight. It no longer explained anything, and Brooks, without looking up, spoke again, his voice cutting gently through the space. "Titles help people talk about things," he said. "They do not always help them see." And that landed differently than anything before it, because it addressed what none of them had said out loud, the assumption that had framed the entire morning, and Logan felt it settle into him with a quiet clarity, because he recognized it immediately, the way he had looked at the old man and decided what he was before giving him a chance to be anything else, and that realization did not sting. It did not challenge him directly, but it stayed, firm and present, and Ethan exhaled slowly beside him, his earlier uncertainty replaced with a calm understanding that did not need confirmation. While Brooks continued his work, the mop gliding across the floor in smooth, controlled strokes, each pass leaving behind a clean, even surface that reflected not just the light above, but the still figures standing around him. And in that reflection, the difference was clear, not in the old man, but in them. The way they stood now, quieter, more aware, less certain of the lines they had drawn before, and Logan finally lowered the rifle completely, letting it rest at his side as he took a small step back, not out of hesitation, but out of respect that had formed without being asked for. And in that moment, no one needed to say anything, because the shift had already happened, silently, completely, and without any need for recognition. The air in the barracks settled into a new kind of stillness, not empty, but measured, as if every movement now carried an awareness that had not been there before, and Logan Hayes felt it in the way his grip on the rifle had changed, no longer firm with control, but steady with understanding, his fingers adjusting almost unconsciously as he mirrored the subtle positioning he had seen just minutes ago. And this time when he cycled the action, he did not rush it. He let the sound speak, clean and precise. And for the first time that morning, he nodded to himself, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement of something learned without instruction. While across the polished floor Daniel Brooks continued his work, the mop tracing another quiet arc that reflected the overhead lights in long, unbroken lines, and that reflection caught more than just light now. It held posture, distance, awareness, and Ethan Cole saw it clearly. The way Brooks never turned fully toward any one person, yet missed nothing. The way his presence filled the room without demanding it, and Ethan stepped closer again, this time not out of curiosity, but with a purpose he could not fully explain, his voice low and steady. "Sir, you knew before you touched it." And it was not a question, it was a realization spoken out loud, and Brooks paused just enough to acknowledge it, his eyes shifting briefly toward Ethan before returning to the floor. "You listen long enough," he said. "You start hearing things early." And that answer settled deeper than the others, because it was not about skill alone, it was about time, patience, and attention layered together until they became something else entirely. And Logan exhaled slowly, the weight of that settling into him as he lowered the rifle and stepped back another half step, not because he had to, but because it felt right, because space had meaning now, and behind him one of the younger SEALs shifted again, his earlier certainty gone, replaced with something quieter, more reflective, and he looked down at his own gear as if seeing it differently, as if wondering what he had missed before, and no one rushed to fill the silence that followed, because it no longer needed to be filled, it held its own, steady and complete. And Brooks resumed his motion, the mop gliding forward with the same calm rhythm, unaffected by the shift around him, as if the moment had already passed for him the second it ended. And that was what stayed with Logan the most, not the adjustment, not the precision, but the absence of any need to claim it. And he watched for another second, then another, before finally speaking again, his voice lower than it had been all morning, stripped of challenge, stripped of ego. "Thank you," he said, simple and direct, and the words landed in the room with a quiet weight, because they were not expected, not from him, not in this place. And Brooks did not turn, did not respond in any visible way, but there was the slightest pause in his movement, just enough to acknowledge the words without breaking the rhythm. And then the mop continued forward, steady as ever, leaving behind a clean, reflective surface that held the moment without needing to preserve it. And Logan nodded once, more to himself than anyone else, before turning slightly, the rifle now resting comfortably at his side, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, but aligned with something he had not fully understood until now. And as the room slowly returned to motion around them, it did so differently, quieter, more aware, each man carrying a piece of the moment with him, not as a lesson spoken, but as something experienced, something that did not need to be repeated to be remembered. And at the center of it all, Daniel Brooks remained exactly where he had been from the start, moving one steady line at a time, leaving behind nothing but a clean floor and a silence that said everything. The morning carried on, but it no longer felt like the same morning. The sharp edges of routine softened into something quieter, more deliberate, as if the room itself had learned to listen, and Logan Hayes stood for a moment longer than necessary before finally turning away, the rifle resting naturally at his side, not as a symbol of authority, but as a tool he now understood just a little better. And that difference stayed with him as he moved, each step measured without being forced, while behind him the others resumed their tasks with a similar shift, voices lower, movements more aware, the earlier noise replaced by a steady rhythm that felt closer to purpose than performance. And Ethan Cole lingered near the edge of the freshly cleaned floor, his gaze drifting once more to Daniel Brooks, watching the old man continue his work without interruption, the mop gliding forward in smooth, consistent lines that reflected the overhead lights like quiet strips of silver. And there was something final in that motion, not an ending, but a return, a reminder that whatever had just happened did not need to be held on to matter. It had already done its work, and Ethan nodded slightly to himself before stepping back, understanding now that not every lesson came with instruction, and not every teacher needed a title. And across the room Logan paused at the doorway, just for a second, his hand resting lightly against the frame as he looked back, not searching this time, not questioning, just acknowledging. And Brooks did not look up, did not break his rhythm, because he did not need to. The moment did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to those who had witnessed it, and that was enough. And Logan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before stepping out into the bright late morning light, where the world carried on as it always did, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside those walls. And back in the barracks the sound of the mop continued, steady and unchanging, moving one line at a time across the floor until the surface was clear, smooth, and reflective, leaving behind no trace of the moment except in the way it had changed the men who stood there. And as the last section of the floor caught the light, Daniel Brooks paused just briefly, not to admire the work, not to reflect on anything that had passed, but simply to move the bucket a few inches to the side before continuing. The motion as natural as breathing, as unremarkable as any other part of his day. And in that simplicity there was something complete, something that did not need recognition to exist, because it had already fulfilled its purpose, quietly, precisely, and without a single wasted word. And if there was anything left behind, it was not the memory of what had been said or done, but the understanding that settled in its place, steady and lasting, that respect does not arrive with noise or demand attention to be real. It reveals itself in the moments where nothing needs to be proven, and everything is already known.